Visual imagery is one of the most effective mental strategies because, as I mentioned in my last video, there are countless benefits to visualizing that complement and reinforce each other to help improve performance. Because there are different benefits, how long and what you visualize will depend on your goals and on the context. In this video, I'll be giving you science-based tips so that you can get the most out of visual imagery. According to the sports psychology literature, visual imagery has both cognitive and motivational functions that can either be specific or general in nature. For example, to motivate yourself, you can imagine something specific like making a game-winning shot or achieving a long-term goal like being accepted to a professional team. Or more generally, by imagining yourself thinking positive thoughts, using deep breathing to stay focused, and having a flawless performance. The cognitive functions of visual imagery are to plan, practice, and prepare.
Great job.
An example of cognitive specific visual imagery would be to imagine yourself correctly executing a sports skill, like chipping a ball onto the green or beating an opponent. An example of cognitive general visual imagery would be to imagine success in different situations during your competition, even in undesirable situations. For example, imagining yourself being taken down, yet remaining calm and composed and finding a way to overcome the adversity. You can use all or a combination of these 4 imagery types depending on what exactly you want to achieve. In terms of what perspective you should use to visualize, the research isn't clear. Both an internal and external perspective have proven effective, so feel free to use either or both perspectives. Research has found that people from individualistic cultures, on average, tend to see and recall memories of themselves from the internal, whereas people from collectivist cultures tend to do so from the external. There is scientific support for both perspectives, so feel free to visualize from whichever one you want. Some skills may benefit more from using internal imagery, while others may benefit more from using external imagery. For example, if you want to practice certain movements that you normally don't pay attention to from an internal perspective, you can imagine yourself from the external to capture the details of the movement. Conversely, if you want to practice staying calm as you dodge your opponent's sequences, for example, you can visualize from the internal. In terms of how long you should visualize, that will depend on your goals and on your skill level. To give you an example of how much elite athletes visualize, in his book, Jack Nicklaus, one of the greatest golfers of all time, writes that he would never hit a shot, even in practice, without having a very sharp, in-focus picture of it in his head. It's the same thing with other elite athletes like Michael Phelps, Conor McGregor, Alex Honnold, and Tom Brady, to name a few. In terms of skill level, advanced level athletes benefit from mental practice to a greater extent than beginners. A basketball study found that visual imagery was almost as effective as physical practice for the advanced group, whereas physical practice was far superior to visual imagery for beginners. A likely explanation for this is that through training, advanced athletes develop more effective and efficient movements, which makes it easier to imagine proper technique. Essentially, for visual imagery to facilitate performance, a certain amount of skill is necessary. So, if you're new to a sport, do not expect to improve quickly with visual imagery alone. You must also put in the long hours of physical training to develop your skills. In summary, what, when, and how long you visualize will depend on what your goals are at that specific point in time and on your sport. However, there are 3 tips that are generally applicable to most athletes and situations that will help you get the most out of visual imagery. Tip number 1 is to make your visual imagery as real as possible. To understand why it is so important to make your visual imagery as close to reality as possible, you first need to understand the reasons why it works. Psychologists have come up with several different explanations, so I will only be summarizing 3 common theories. Number 1, psychoneuromuscular theory is that visual imagery works because it results in subliminal neuromuscular patterns that are identical to the patterns used during actual movement. Number 2, functional equivalence hypothesis is that visual imagery and actual physical execution of actions share the same neurophysiological processes. And number 3, symbolic learning theory is that visual imagery works because we plan our actions and create mental models of movements and alternative solutions in advance. For example, research has found that cells in our brain called mirror neurons are activated both when we perform a movement and when we see someone do the same. Based on these theories, if we want to get the most out of visual imagery, we must make the images in our mind as vivid as possible in order to activate similar neurophysiological and neuromuscular patterns that we would activate during the real thing. Basically, the closer we can get our visual imagery to feel like reality, the better we can simulate and practice the real thing in advance. For example, let's say you're preparing for an MMA fight. You can make your visual imagery more vivid by including all of the senses that you would experience in real life. Some examples are the sound of the roaring fans, the feeling of your warmed up muscles, the feeling of sweat dripping down your face, controlled breathing, the feeling of your bare feet on the canvas, the bright lights, the feeling of your wrapped hands and 4-ounce gloves, the calm emotions or excitement, your heartbeat, having your name called out, etc. The more details you can think of, the better. The goal is to simulate what you will experience ahead of time so that you feel confident and a feeling of familiarity with the situation when it's time to compete. Tip number 2 is to be consistent. As I mentioned in a previous video, repetition is the key to rewiring your brain. The more you activate certain brain regions, the stronger and larger the connections become, and the faster they will fire. And the last tip is to have fun with it and think big. Most, if not all, athletes have conscious or unconscious limitations that are formed through experiences and conditioning. Conditioning is the process of training or accustoming someone to behave in a certain way or to accept certain circumstances. An example of this is the story of the 4-minute mile. Since 1886, runners had been chasing the goal of running a mile under 4 minutes. Experts believed this to be dangerous and almost impossible. The feat was as much a psychological barrier as a physical one. In 1954, it was finally accomplished by Roger Bannister. Then something strange happened. 46 days after Bannister's feat, an Australian runner beat Bannister's time. Then, a year after that, 3 runners broke the 4-minute barrier in a single race. Essentially, when Roger Bannister broke the limit, people saw that it was possible, which eliminated the mental barrier, leading others to achieve the same. My point is that you can use visual imagery to do the same thing. By vividly visualizing yourself overcoming challenges and achieving your goals, you can begin to deconstruct your mental barriers and limitations. Keep an open mind and imagine what you want to achieve, no matter how daunting it may seem. As Michael Phelps' coach would tell him, you need to watch your thoughts and your vocabulary in order to keep an open mind and to achieve big things.
But it's also about getting your mind right as well. I think one of the craziest things my coach tried to get me when we started to train together to not say the word can't. So I could broaden my mind and believe that I could do whatever I wanted to. And I think that was a big key of us being so successful.
I hope that these tips help you develop a framework or routine. Everyone is different, so experiment with these ideas and figure out what works best for you. Give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video and subscribe to get the best mental strategies for elite performance. Thanks for watching.